behalf of our Board of Trustees, it's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening. Let me quickly remind you that we have two upcoming programs in December. First of all, on the 6th of December, professor from Georgetown, Professor Koenig, will be speaking on the case for the Trump foreign policy. Now, it's not like one of those it's not a joke like the book of Italian war heroes, right? The shortest book ever written. But we look forward to it, and the council is committed to always presenting as full and complete a picture of the incumbent administration's thinking as we can. And and that, of course, is the first program we'll have in that direction on the 6th of December. And then sort of by coincidence, a week later, Jake Sullivan, who was Mr. Biden's national security advisor, he was chairman of the policy planning staff at State Department and an assistant secretary and close advisor to Hillary Clinton. And he'll be speaking on the future of the United States in global affairs. So that's December 6th and 13th. Some of you probably noticed the obituaries in the Sun in the past week, and Lane Burke is not sitting there this evening. Lane is well known to many of you as an activist in the Baltimore community, hugely active in the civil rights movement in the 60s and early 70s, and in a number of other causes. And she would sit in the front row about there with a notebook and take notes and ask intelligent questions afterwards. And one of our staff members showed me today a picture from 1982 of Lane sitting in the first row diligently taking notes. And I know she would have especially liked to have been here this evening because she had a marvelous African art collection, of course, and as I said, had been active in the civil rights movement. And after a very interesting career doing so many things, she joined the Peace Corps and spent 3 years in Africa in the Peace Corps. So she was certainly would have been interested in this evening's performance. I usually don't do this, but it's been such a long time seeing her sit in that seat that I thought I had to, and her interests were very much in tune with this evening's presentation. Well, as you know, we've asked our guest to do the impossible. We've asked her to address the opportunities and challenges to Africa today. And there are both, of course. Our guest is a trained physician. She's a product of Fisk University, first of all, and then Meharry Medical College in Tennessee. And she was very active as a medical practitioner in Tennessee for a quarter of a century. She owned and was CEO of medical centers in the area. She's known as a philanthropist. She's been very active over the past number of years in international women's matters, and of course has been in the service of Africa with a real deep interest in both the medical possibilities for the diaspora helping the countries of Africa, and in the relationship of the African states with the African diaspora. So it's an interesting package of interests which he's had following an extraordinarily successful career in medicine. It's my great pleasure to introduce her. Thanks so very much for coming.
I couldn't help but be reminded and be taken back by your comments about the lady who was a Peace Corps. I am a product of the Peace Corps myself. My education in Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia. In high school, most of my teachers were Americans, British, Australians, and New Zealanders. I have to tell you, growing up in apartheid Zimbabwe, for the British, it was very clear who was who. But what I remember the most about my American Peace Corps teachers is how simple and down to earth they were. They were teachers who would invite you to their houses for afternoon tea. They were teachers who wanted to go to your village with you on weekends, sit cross-legged with you and eat with their fingers out of the same bowl. I remember distinctly as a little girl back then that when I grew up, wherever these people came from, that's where I wanted to go. And fast forward, I ended up getting a scholarship, believe it or not, from the US government. But the scholarship, I could have gone anywhere else on earth. When the choice was given to me, there was no doubt in my mind I was going to America. I had several acceptances into universities in America, but I had no clue where any of them were. I remember taking a map of the United States, and I was supposed to fly into New York City and trying to map out how far each one of them was from New York City and calculating the distance. So I wanted to go as far as I could go so I could see more of America. Never dawned on me that you're going to be in the plane. Fisk University said, Music City, USA. And when you are a youngster in your teenage years, you hear Music City. I had visions of good-looking black men with big afros and nice bell-button pants, walking up and down the streets with boom boxes on their shoulders, dancing to reggae music. Of course, I came to Tennessee. It wasn't quite the reggae music I was expecting. But more importantly, my scholarship was the African American Institute in New York then. And they allowed us to spend a week running up and down New York City, getting accustomed to our new home. My geography teacher back in Rhodesia then, we learned about the Tennessee Valley Authority. And I still remember he called it Tenese. So it was the Tenese Valley to me. And when I was in New York, the ladies were, I'm sure a lot of them must have been Peace Corps. They'd been to Africa and they knew how to deal with us Africans coming through. And at that time, it was mostly South Africans during the apartheid and Zimbabweans. And so quite a few of us would come. And there was a lady by the name of Charlotte McPherson. She was the program director. And we pretty much, she was like our mother. She took very good care of all of us. And lucky ones, we got to stay with her in her apartment, which was on some very top floor, I remember that. And the ladies in the offices were also very nice. And my last day, ready to go to Tennessee, and the ladies would ask all of us, so where are you going? Where are you going? And I said, oh, I'm going to Tenese. And the lady looked at me and said, where is that? I said, you don't know where Tenese is? She said, spell it. So I spelled it. She said, oh, you mean Tennessee? And I still remember thinking to myself, I just spent a whole week telling people I'm going to Tenese, and nobody said anything. But so it was, I went to Tenese, and it was the best choice. Tenese has been wonderful to me. So has been the Americans. The most common question asked to me was, how did a black person, and more importantly, keep in mind, I did go to school there. I did spend some time in New York during my residency, and then I went back because I met a boy, and that always happens. So I had to go back to Tennessee. And I ended up opening my first practice in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. It's a small town right outside Nashville. And they'll say, you're a black person, you live in Murfreesboro, Tennessee? I said, yeah. You know, it never occurred to me that I was black. See, growing up in my village, I was African. And so the issue of coming to Tennessee and going to Fisk University and being told you're black and beautiful, I thought that was insulting. Because why? In my village, the idea of beauty was based on deeds. So how can you just see me and say you're beautiful? You don't know me. You're not qualified to define my beauty. But I had to learn that in America, that's what you do. You run around telling people they're beautiful, and you run around telling them that you love them, even though you don't know them. I thought I understood English. I thought I spoke English until I got to Tennessee. And I found out there was another type of English. My first encounter, I walk into a clothing store. I wanted to buy a dress, which I did. And on my way out, there was a little ding ding as you open the door. And the lady behind me yells back and says, "Hurry back." So I assumed I'd forgotten something, so I ran back like an obedient African girl. When I got to the cash register, the lady looks at me and says, "Can I help you?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, you said for me to hurry back." And she said, "Well, I meant come back to see us." I said, "What for?" "Well, in case you want to buy something else." And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, these people are so bold. I just spent my last penny with you, so not only do you want me to go home and get some more money, you want me to run back home, get more money, come back, so you can tell me again to hurry back, so I can go back again. I said, what is wrong with these people? I had a girlfriend who came to me and says, "You know this guy? I keep running into him, and he keeps saying, 'I'll catch you later.' I think he likes me, but he just hasn't had time to come and tell me that he likes me. Except the guy was just being nice. 'I'll catch you later.'" What do you mean you catch me later? I'm not running away. What a journey. Coming to America and coming to Tunis. Fast forward, I'm minding my own business in the middle of the night when a phone call came. It was the chairman of the African Union who made it very clear that the African Union has concluded that in order for true sustainable change to come to Africa, it has to be brought by the African diaspora. And she has decided I was to be the one. As a medical doctor and really never been involved in diplomacy, that was a tall order. She courted me like a man would have been courting a woman for 6 months, because I wasn't quite sure if I would be able to face the challenge. But finally, my husband looked at me and said, "Honey, you're being given a tremendous platform, a platform that you can do a lot more that you have been doing to date." And he said, "If you don't accept this position, I don't ever want to hear you talk about what is wrong with our Africa." So it was that I did accept the position. As I've been traveling around this country as well as the continent, I'm appalled at how people just don't know about the African Union. So I've made it a mission to start every presentation by sharing with you the history of the African Union. The first ever non-union of any African states was in 1958. This is soon after our colonial masters were giving up their colonies. France in particular gave its colonies 2 choices. You can be free with some attachments to France, or you can be free completely with no attachments to France at all. They did not fathom any African country that would want to be free with no attachments to France, but to their surprise, Guinea and Mali said, "No way, Jose, we want total liberation. Thank you, France. It's been wonderful, but go back home." Of course, the French, in their anger, they went in and took everything that they thought they had brought to Africa in those countries. They proceeded to pour concrete into the sewage pipes and completely devastated the 2 economies. The newly appointed president of Ghana, graduate of Lincoln University, thank you very much, in Pennsylvania, in his efforts to help these two economies, created the first ever known union of any African states, which was Ghana, Guinea, and Mali. A few years later, a few states met in Morocco, and a few more states met in Addis Ababa. By 1963, the Pan-African leaders of the time decided it was time that the Africans rebuilt and recreated that which was destroyed by our colonial masters, starting with the implementation of the rule of divide and conquer during the Berlin Conference of 1885. And this is when they sat down, pulled out the map of Africa, and mind you, that was after they had made a decision that the African kingdoms that they found in Africa were too powerful, too sophisticated, with educational systems and religious systems, that if those systems were maintained, the program of turning Africa into a truly dominated continent would not succeed. So then they started with their program to make sure that they are going to let the Africans believe that everything that is African is bad and inferior, and that everything that is Western is better and desirable. So by 1885, they were ready for implementation. And during the Berlin Conference of 1885, they would look at a humongous kingdom. The more powerful the kingdom was, the more countries that came out of it. The birth of small countries like Togo, Guinea, Mali was conceived. Let me take you back to a country like Burundi, a country like Rwanda during genocide. It's easy for us to be superficial and understand Africa from a superficial point of view. The issue of the Hutus and the Tutsis goes back to 1885, Berlin Conference. First, Rwanda was given to Germany. Then Germany turned around and gave it to Belgium. The Belgians came in and said, well, you Tutsis, your nasal bridges have a smaller angulation. They used rulers to measure their nasal bridges. The straighter your nasal bridge was, the more desirable you were. And so the divisions began. The Hutus were felt to be less, not as beautiful, and not well suited to serve the master. And the Tutsis were more desirable. Fast forward, the Catholic priests came in and said, well, you Hutus, do you not see what the Tutsis are doing to you? They're coming to get you because they think you are not as beautiful and as desirable as you should be. So it is that the divisions deepened. What we saw in 1994 was the tip of the iceberg. You often wonder who was funding all those machetes that were pumped into Rwanda during that 1 month. So it is. I could go on and on about some of the situations going on in Africa, but be it as it may, as I take on my challenge as the ambassador of the African Union, I can't help but find myself going back to the beginning. How did we, the Africans, get here? And also, furthermore, come to the realization that our journey is far from over, that the seeds that were planted by our colonial masters centuries ago are still alive and well. I don't know if some of you have heard of the situation at Cornell. There was an article where the African-American students were protesting against the continental African students and the Caribbean students, claiming that the continental Africans and the Caribbean students were receiving preferential treatments by the Ivy League schools and using them to fill the quota for black enrollment. They did not protest against the Asians. They did not protest against the lower percentage of black enrollment, but it was easier to go after my brother. It was easier to go after my sister. I couldn't help but be reminded that that seed has percolated through generations, which is why the status of black people today is what it is. But the real bigger issue as I face the challenge of rebuilding our Africa is the realization that quite often many of us are still deeply colonized. Our actions are colonized. Our thinking, our decision-making processes, when we sit across that boardroom table as a CEO with degrees from Harvard and all the big schools around the world, we're still making decisions for Africa with a colonized mind. We're still leading our Africa with a colonized mind. And yet, we don't even realize that our actions are colonized. So as an ambassador, I wonder, where do I begin? Garbage in, garbage out. You look at the exploitation that's going on in Africa today. Some things are just as simple to say, why can't the Africans just fix this? Why can't we pick up a brick from point A to point B successfully in a straight line? But no, we gotta go to Honolulu and Timbuktu before we can take this brick right here. The legacy of colonialism. Over the years, we have seen masses, millions of Africans leave Africa for various reasons. Wars, in search of greener pastures. The brain drain that has occurred in Africa to date makes the issue of developing and building the Africa we want mission impossible. There are more doctors, Ghanaian doctors in New York City than in all of Ghana. There are more doctors out of Nigeria in New York City than in Nigeria itself. So the brain drain that has been going on for years must be reversed. How do we go about doing it? It's not easy to just say, African diaspora, please, go back home. Go back home where? And live a life that's nowhere near what I'm used to. And yet our Africa, with all its wealth, the richest continent on earth, the continent that still has 80%, upwards of 80% of its natural resources still intact. The continent that the West world, not strategic planning process that goes on without Africa at the center, because everything and anything the West needs can be found in Africa. I was in a meeting today and we were talking about elections in the DRC. And I remember my brother from DRC saying, well, we gotta get some money. We need help we need some money to help us organize elections. And even after he finished talking, I thought to myself, DRC is one of the richest countries in Africa. And I'm sitting here and the DRC cannot come up with enough money to hold elections. Such is our reality in Africa. There's something terribly wrong with that picture. So when I analyze what Africa has to offer, talk about the minerals, check, we got that. Talk about the oil, check, we got that. The sun, solar, we got that. The best solar on earth. The only thing we have left to really complete the puzzle of what Africa needs are its diaspora and Friends of Africa. You see, 1963, when Kwame Nkrumah came along with the Pan-African leaders, he made one proclamation. He said, you're not African because you were born in Africa, but rather you are African because Africa is born in you. I know many who may have been born in Africa who are not Africans. And I also equally know many who may never have set foot in Africa who are very much Africans. I know many who have left Africa with suitcases chock full of humility, honor, and goodwill. But I equally know many who went to Africa with suitcases full of greed. I do know that between the African diaspora and the Friends of Africa who have Africa born in them, Africa is rich. And with a proper strategic plan in place, Africa can take its rightful place on the world stage. But it's going to come with the world speaking with one voice and saying, enough is enough. The exploitation that's going on in Africa must stop, and it must stop now. The world coming together and saying the corruption that's going on in Africa and into Africa must equally stop, because as long as the corruption is going on, we are fetching water with a leaking bucket. That's not an environment that investors want to come to. The land of milk and honey, that is our Africa. The land that is really a gift to the world. Some of you may not realize it, but when the world was one, when the world was Pangaea, the original map, I don't know how many of you know of Pangaea. That is our earth. That is the original map. So Africa belongs to all of us. Life began in Africa. But we must treat our Mother Africa fairly. Manage her resources fairly. Treat her fairly. Let's share our Africa fairly, without one exploiting the other. One of the missions I have in my position is to pave the way for not only the diaspora, but Friends of Africa who have Africa on their mind, to go and join hands with us in building not only the Africa that we love, but the Africa that we need and the Africa that we want. Tremendous opportunities in education, healthcare, private sector development, energy, infrastructure development, you name it, opportunities are everywhere. But quite often, I know many investors who have gone to Africa who have lost money. I know many investors who have gone to Africa and did not realize the dream that they went out to get. Well, I have a responsibility to make sure that no more. Because people of goodwill, people who have Africa on their mind, must go to Africa and realize that which Africa has to offer. And we as Africans have a responsibility to make sure that we welcome you and pave the way for you and give you the right partnerships. So when you invest in Africa, the return on your investment is what you are expecting. But in return, you are also investing in the people of Africa. Let's take, for example, healthcare. If all the African diaspora doctors were to go back today, we're only going to meet 10% of the need. So no matter what we do, capacity building is what Africa needs. So that means projects in healthcare galore. So we have decided to embark on a program to truly rebuild our Africa from the ground, and paving the way for the African diaspora and Friends of Africa to participate in the development of Africa. Currently, we have a plan to build 5 diaspora villages. Each village is going to be in one region, which will be a growth point for that region. It's going to have, starting out with a 1,000-bed hospital. Thank goodness, President of Zambia has stepped up to the plate and given us 132 acres of land, and there is more. On the Zambian side of Victoria Falls, prime location to start to build this village. There's going to be a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant. I don't know how many of you know, but over 50% of drugs going into Africa today have zero bioavailability. That corruption I was talking about again. People are dying thinking they're taking diabetic medications, high blood pressure medications, antibiotics. It happened to me. Sometimes when I travel, my legs swell, so I usually have my Lasix with me. This time I forgot my Lasix. I was in Ghana. So my husband and his friends said, oh, there's a pharmacy around the corner. I normally take only 20 milligrams. But they brought me a little thing with 40 milligram tablets. I'm like, 40 milligrams, that's too strong. But the little pill was so small, I said, okay, I'll just take it. It's one time. No response. Normally I would take 20 milligrams of Lasix, I'll be in the bathroom for 4 hours. So the following day, I said to my husband, my legs are still swollen. We got to do something. And his friend said, well, you know, I don't know how many of you have gone to Ghana, but there's this beautiful hotel called Morven Peak. It's a 5-star hotel, just fantastic place. He said, well, we heard that if you really want real medicine, you go to Morven Peak. So sure enough, they went to Morven Peak and got me a 20 milligram Lasix. I was in the bathroom for 6 hours. It is a serious problem. So we are going to have pharmaceutical manufacturing plant in order to begin to address that issue. We'll also have 5-star hotels for health tourism and a university. And of course, agriculture is big in anything that we do. So there's going to be, our land is already, we have been told it will be, we'll be given more land because there will be serious agricultural projects going on there. And of course, the infrastructure that goes along and the energy projects that come along. I'm saying this to say everything that's going to be done in that village can be duplicated millions of times over in the entire continent because there is need. Huge, tremendous need. My responsibility is to see to it that those who have Africa on their mind, I pave the way for them to go to Africa and have a heck of a good time. But more importantly, partnering those friends of Africa with the African diaspora is a marriage that is destined to succeed. So while I am doing the politicking that I don't understand, that I attempt to try to understand, but I'm certainly not afraid to roll my sleeves and go to work and do what it takes to help build that Africa that we want and help the Africans come together. Birds sing not because they can, but because they have a song. The Africans have a song. Along with their friends of Africa, we hope to join hands and give the world the best melody the world has ever heard. In unison, as children of one Mother Africa, those born in Africa and those with Africa born in them. Because I do know one thing for sure, that if we come together and speak with one voice, Africa will make it to the promised land someday. Thank you.
You answer them.
Okay.
Well, thanks very much for that view of the need of Africa, the great need of Africa, and its great potential. But now we have a chance to ask questions which may deal with a variety of curiosities in the audience. I've explained to the ambassador that I have to repeat the questions for the television camera. And we will, at 10 minutes after 7, I'll say some people can go if they really have to, and then we'll stay on for another 15 minutes. Ma'am, are there oil wells in the village that you're planning?
And that land, because you said you were rich with the blood of the
Yes.
natural resources.
We are going to be having 5 villages. And right now, the first village is in Zambia. There would be a village in West Africa, plus any development projects that go along with the region. So yes, most of West Africa has oil. Most of Northern Africa has oil.
Who owns them?
Well, you're taking this conversation somewhere else. If the truth be told, if you look at all the Francophone countries, all minerals discovered and yet to be discovered are owned by France. All oil discovered and yet to be discovered is owned by France. We get royalties ranging from 12 to 15%. I was in Kimberley, South Africa, a few years back, and we were just being tourists. Almost every 30 minutes, there was a 737 landing and taking off, landing right into South Africa, picking up. And so finally I said to my tour guide, what are all these planes doing? This is not an international airport. Why are they all these planes coming? He said, oh, they're picking up the diamonds. And the diamonds are going straight to the London Stock Exchange. He said, yeah, and when the diamonds get over there, we're not even sure how they're reporting them. So the true diamonds that are coming out of here, we may never quite know. But South Africa gets royalties. DRC, they have tarmacs right in the jungle. 737s are landing in the jungle, picking up that coltan and taking off right out of the country, in and out. The mining is done by the French companies. The oil drills are run by the French companies. Now you understand what I was saying again to say, why can't we move this brick from point A to point B? Those are questions that we have to say, there is definitely something wrong with this picture. 60% of the world cocoa comes from West Africa, and yet we don't have a single cocoa processing plant. Go figure that. But that is our reality in Africa, and that equation has got to change. This ship must turn, because the game we are playing right now, we're using a losing strategy, and they have been playing a game with a losing strategy for far too long. So I can honestly tell you, as an African, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, and something's got to give.
Would you comment on Chinese investments and major efforts of various kinds in Africa?
The involvement of the Chinese in Africa is an interesting one. You see, when you're hungry and you need food now, you'll get what you can get. So the difference between the Chinese, and I say this to my colleagues in the right places, to say, you all turn around and complain about China coming to Africa, but the reality is when I'm hungry and I need food now, I go to China, they say, how much? I come to the West, they make me jump through so many hoops. By the end of the hoops, I may not even finish. I will die before I finish jumping the hoops. That's the difference. So yes, as much as we may not, we're beginning to pull back now. Because China came in when African countries are having difficulties making ends meet. I mean, ideally, I would like to say, you know what, it's calculated that over $500 billion is leaving Africa every year from the Francophone countries to France. I'd like to say, France, please, stop that. Because we're the poor continent, and we're giving billions of dollars to France. If Africa could be allowed to keep what's rightfully belongs to Africa, maybe, just maybe, we could begin to turn the corner. So China is coming in to fill the gap that somehow the West has vacated. And we realize the issues with China, but now we are beginning to pull back and renegotiating those agreements. The difference between China and the United States in their engagement with Africa and the rest of Europe is that China and the United States never colonized Africa. So when we come to the table as Africans and the Americans on one side and the Chinese on the other side, we are losing the game because we're coming into a fight with knives, and the Americans have 357 Magnums. So until we Africans can now also come to the table properly armed, but at least we're having a conversation from an equal footing. France, we have got to first uproot France from the roots. And those roots are so deep-rooted. How do you take companies that are benefiting out of Africa and try to stabilize a country so the country can move on? Look at DRC. DRC, it's going to take a long time for DRC to be independent because of special interests. All those planes that are taking the mine, the minerals out of the jungle every day, how do you stop them? They're the ones who are going to start the coup. They're the ones who are going to start the civil war. Anything to keep the Africans chaotic while they continue to siphon what they want to siphon. That is also our reality. So even if we were to stop all the corruption from the leaders today, even if we were to stop all the terrorist activities in the different parts of Africa today, those outside forces will never allow it. They'll keep stirring the pot. Because you see, a stable Africa is an Africa that cannot be exploited. I don't know if some of you heard the story about 23, I'm sure all of you know, 23 years ago. There was a group of young men who were having fun in South Africa, and around that time, Equatorial Guinea had just discovered oil, and they cooked up a plan to have a coup in Equatorial Guinea, so while the Guineans were busy fighting a civil war, they're siphoning the oil. So it was sold as a quick investment with huge returns. The only mistake they made was they also wanted to acquire some weapons from Zimbabwe. So half their flight was full of weapons from South Africa. These were non-Africans, by the way. Prime Minister Thatcher's son was actually leading the group. I don't know if some of you can Google the story. There's actually a book on it. She had to fly into Zimbabwe and pay handsomely to get her son out. But he was leading the whole operation. Some guys, the young people were from Britain, Australia, New Zealand. Some of them were mercenaries. So they filled up their big plane, and they stopped in Zimbabwe to pick up more ammunition. But I'm told Mugabe smelled a rat and wondered why young men who are going to hunt in Equatorial Guinea needed such powerful rifles. So he did more investigation. It turns out that they had picked up a diaspora from Guinea, Equatorial Guinea, who lived in the islands, and he was supposed to be put in as the president after a coup would have occurred. But of course, the whole plan was foiled, and those young people were arrested in Zimbabwe. And I do believe the last ones left the prison in Zimbabwe maybe a few years back, but that was 23 years ago. So there would have been a civil war going on after a coup in Equatorial Guinea, and the world will just say, well, here they go, the Africans again. Well, that's all they do. They're always fighting. But people with no gun, not a single gun manufacturing plant in Africa. Where are the endless guns coming from? Who is supplying these young people with endless guns? So there's a bigger picture that I think the world needs to understand. Yes, we have issues with our leaders. Yes, we have issues of corruption, but equally, if we're going to address the issues of corruption in Africa, let's have a bird's eye view. There is humongous corruption coming from outside, and yes, there is also corruption from within. So both have got to be addressed if we are to really begin to get Africa in a position that Africa can take care of itself.
The question, I think, is given behaviors which are corrupt in their nature, with respect to the food example you gave, and with respect to inaccurate reporting via the media, what can you do about it?
Well, again, that's where the African Union has got to take charge. And when it comes to the issue of rice, we have no business importing rice, period. We've got plenty of land. We need to do our own farming. That's why agriculture is front and center. Most of the African economies, particularly sub-Saharan, are going to be agriculturally led. We have got to grow our own. Why are we importing rice from China? Why are we importing maize from Brazil? We can grow all that. We have the land. Africa can actually be the breadbasket of the world. Again, back to, it's mind-boggling, those of Africans to say, why can't we get this? There's nothing to agriculture except just do it. But somehow we don't. So that one, importing rice out of plastic out of China, we own that. And we need to do something about it. There is no excuse for that one. And that goes to governance.
What action advice do you give to Friends of Africa?
I think joining hands with the African diaspora is going to be what it's going to take. Because when you look at the situation on the continent, the capacity is just not there to fill the need. So in order for us to really develop the continent, we're going to need to join hands. The repatriation of the African diaspora is going to be crucial. The African Union has concluded true sustainable change has got to involve significant participation of the African diaspora and Friends of Africa, because the expertise that we need is outside and not inside.
I think the young lady, though, wanted specific actions of some kind.
What we are doing from a legislative point of view, not a whole lot. You are living in America, this is America. If you're in Europe, but in Africa, we're saying, as the African diaspora, these villages will be growth centers that we can manage and even begin to address the issues of corruption. To say, we're going to run and operate these villages and slowly begin to absorb others, not only in that country, but in the region, the way we think Africa should be run. So yes, if you can, we're going to be going on a $10 challenge, which we're going to be launching. The chairperson will be here tomorrow, African Union chair. We're going to be launching $10 and your name, and let's make magic. So your $10, sign up and become a member.
Beyond the diaspora and Friends of Africa, how would you identify the groups within Africa which might dynamically contribute to solutions?
Thank you. That's a good question. Again, it goes back to the issue of capacity. Let's use healthcare as an example. If we were all to go back today, it's only 10% of the need. So you could try and have improvements in healthcare, but you're limited because the capacity is not there. That is just our reality. You look at education, universities, the professors are not there. I have one of my friend's daughters who was in medical school. Simple textbooks they didn't have. I was visiting a hospital, and the doctors there are doing just some amazing things. General practitioners performing procedures that usually in this country are performed by OBGYNs. The country only had 3 OBGYNs. They wanted to start a residency program, but to start a residency program, you need 5. I'm talking simple things. So how do you begin to move forward when the capacity is just not there? And that's why they're looking to the diaspora and Friends of Africa to fill the gap. In the immediate, our reality is even in schools, you have classes that have 100, 150 students per class. So we are fetching water with a leaking bucket. Unless decisions are made to put plans that are sustainable, that you can say 10 years from now, where are we? 10 years from now, are we at 15% of the doctors that are needed? Are we at 20? But right now we are going nowhere because the environment is not good enough for the diaspora to come back. But we are saying when we create these villages, we will create that environment that will make it possible for the diaspora to go back home and participate in the building of Africa. At every level, engineers, any sector, we just don't have the capacity.
Would you comment on the work that the Gates Foundation has done in Africa?
The Gates Foundation has done tremendous work in Africa in various areas, malaria, you name it. But here's one issue that we're trying to address it, but it's always very difficult. We have NGOs doing work across the continent. It's been estimated that in the past 70 years, trillions of dollars have gone into Africa through NGOs and other organizations. But when we turn around and say, what do we have to show for it? If we look at development that is strategic, 40 years ago, Malaysia was in the same place as Ghana, but look where they are now. Singapore, far more advanced than Ghana's because money was put into Singapore with a strategic plan that was designed to bring change in a sustainable way. In Africa, we are piecemealing everything. You can go into a country and you can say, take 10 NGOs. This one is doing malaria, this one is doing TB, this one is doing that. But at the end of the day, they send all these beautiful reports where they come from, success rate. Oh, we treated 1,000 people and all of them were free of TB. They may be free of TB, but 50% of them are dead. They're free of TB, but dead from high blood pressure.
But isn't it possible to work with a foundation like this and help them see strategic plans?
The question is, I think, how do you work with the Gates Foundation to help them see the strategic desire?
And other foundations too.
And other agencies as well, yes.
I actually have been privileged to have done needs assessment visits in various African countries, and I can tell you I sat down with many NGOs in a country, and I'll ask them, point blank, why aren't you guys coming together and looking at the totality of the healthcare status of the people? Nobody can really give you an answer. They're all doing their own little thing. So that makes you want, I'll be very honest with you, we have quite a few NGOs that are doing great work, but we have a few in their midst that are out there to disrupt and destroy. And their intentions is not to bring sustainable change to Africa. Those must be rooted out.
Would you comment on the phenomena that surround the AIDS problem and comment upon the shortcomings of the present administration?
That's $1 million question. Let's start with HIV. I don't know how many of you might remember the comment that was made by, I think it was Mbeki, when something to the fact that AIDS is not the most common cause of death in Africa or along those lines. And let's stop and think about it for a second. What does AIDS mean? It means autoimmune deficiency syndrome, right? And there are many things. Your immune system is deficient. It's no longer capable of defending you. So there are many causes. Cancer can actually give you AIDS, right? So let's come to Africa. What is the most common cause of AIDS? The true definition of AIDS, not HIV, but AIDS. HIV is one of the many causes. In Africa, the most common cause of AIDS is malnutrition. We have a heck of a lot more people dying from malnutrition than HIV infection. So people just simply misunderstood him, and the PR people did not do a good job of explaining what he was trying to say. If we could give malnutrition the same importance that we give HIV, we would find ourselves in a very different place. Malnutrition is the biggest killer in Africa. Yes, that must be addressed to the same extent, with the same level of aggressiveness as we did with HIV. So even the people with HIV, survival rates will be much higher if we address malnutrition.
When will the villages open, and how are you going to bring the diasporans back in? How quickly, and the rest of that? And how do the diasporans who are coming in cope with brilliant Africans who are already there?
That's a very valid question. The villages, right now we're in the process of creating a diaspora database, mobilization. I like to use an example of the other diasporas in this country. If you look at, I often say, ask for the voices of the Indian diaspora, loud and clear. The Indians are doing amazing things in their countries of birth because they are organized. Ask for the voices of other ethnic groups, the Jews, the Irish, the Chinese, the Mexicans, very organized. They speak with one voice. When you ask for the voices of the Africans, you might as well go to the graveyard because we are nowhere to be heard. So first and foremost, we must unite and we must speak with one voice and we must stand up and be counted. Because unless we know who you are and where you are and what you do, we can't begin to formulate a plan. So first and foremost, diaspora mobilization, creating a professional registry, and of course, fundraising. So that's level one. Once we meet $100 million, we're going to start the ground digging in Africa. I can honestly tell you, we can just about absorb all the Africans in the diaspora in order to meet the challenges in Africa. I'm not saying we don't have the bright minds in Africa already. Yes, we do. Let me give you an example. We had a group of lawyers who was working for the African Union go through a Loyola program for a year. I sat with this group of lawyers at the end of their year. They were in the United States as well as in Europe. And I said, how do you feel now compared to when you ended the program? All of them young lawyers said uniformly, we only applied into the program because we wanted to get out of Africa. But voila, to their surprise, they didn't think they had anything to learn because they are lawyers, they know it, you know? To their surprise, they learned so much that they had programs, that things that they had never thought of doing to implement in the departments that they came from when they go back home. We have a lot of that in Africa, where people think they know. There is so much more to be learned. Even just the exposure to the outside world gives you a different perspective. We are not saying the ones on the continent cannot do it. Absolutely, they can do it. But it needs to be a combination of the diaspora and those who are on the ground working together to move this Africa forward. Clearly, we just don't have the capacity. We can slice it any which way we want. This devil, this monster is still a monster. We got to have capacity. It's capacity building, and capacity building in order for this ship to move forward.
Well, I think all of us have learned a lot of different things and many things from this evening, and we certainly thank you for that. It's been a great pleasure to have you.